G'day guys. This is a video just to look at what's happening around the world, where are we at, and how things are unfolding. A bit stuff that probably you haven't heard, and that's why I decided to do this video. I've been sort of listening to some of the stuff, and I've been reading some of the stuff that, you know, a couple of people in sort of analysts and economists in Greece and stuff like that have been researching. So it's been quite interesting. Some insights and some of the economics and what's been happening within the region. I know even though natural gas has come down a bit, once things get a bit on the chilly side, it's likely to go back up. There's, we're having this warmer period that could actually affect like the growth cycles of certain plants. That's another person that's sort of covered. I forget his name. And it's another guy. So that economist, I yes, and then there's Gapselis or something like that, his name is, who's an international analyst. He was quite interesting, some of the stuff that he was talking about. But anyway, let's get on with it. And I've been doing a bit of my own research as well, just to validate some of the stuff that these people have been saying. And it's been quite interesting, what's been happening. So I've actually checked some of the shipping lines and some of the shipping traffic out of India. That was interesting. I'll explain how that comes into the picture. But at the moment, if you look at Europe, it's still a mess. It's still an unfolding mess. But I have got quite a bit of background information of how a lot of these things proceeded. So there's a thing that certain people have been dubbing the Obama doctrine. And while Obama was in power, towards the end, towards the middle part of his career in power, is when this was fully developed. And the whole attitude was, let's pull back a bit. We're focusing on terrorism and all that, and just let things play out a bit and see how they go and where they go. Because the Americans were at the time were seeing that while they were a very powerful nation in their own right, at the same time they had noticed that they'd taken their finger off the pulse. Things had gone in certain directions, and they weren't very happy. And so they noticed that they had less influence over certain regimes than what they used to have in the past, and they didn't have the capacity anymore to control them. So the Gulf cooperation countries pretty much ignored the Americans on many issues, and it was more America felt that they were more dependent or being influenced over time by the petrostates, that China, had a lot of some of the economic advantages and was affecting the way they could control certain regions. Chinese were basically going into Africa. They were going into parts of the Middle East. They were going into parts of Southeast Asia and competing directly, and then eventually sort of even moving into Europe and competing directly with the Americans. And the Americans didn't really know how to handle this at the time. And so a doctrine emerged that since we've been battered by a whole lot of conflicts in the past, and it cost us a lot of treasure, and it also weakened our position, let's just allow these forces to play out and let's amplify them. And so the whole idea was, let's get the Turks to support the Arab Spring and amplify that. And so there was all these sort of certain strategic countries that were brought into the game without them knowing, in order to amplify certain things around the world to create a certain level of instability that would make a number of countries uncomfortable. You know, you look at South China Sea, you look at Philippines, you look at Vietnam, you look at all these countries feeling very uncomfortable. Indonesia, very uncomfortable. What happens is when you create that uncomfortable, and there's even India, what happens is then, you know, the only country that they can rely on that doesn't want to take any territory away from them, just wants to have influence over them, is the US. And so it was a grand strategy how to basically restore US influence, semi-control over large parts of the world that they had lost after war. They had noticed that the Germans were developing Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2, and the whole purpose behind that was to basically acquire a certain level of energy independence, but at the same time undermine the German establishment was also going into the Ukraine and deliberately creating conditions. I mean, Merkel recently has actually divulged that she was heavily involved in that, but the strategy that Merkel doesn't tell you about is that the whole strategy was to undermine, you know, the relationship between the Ukrainians and the Russians, to improve her relationship and all that. And because the pipelines through the Ukraine, they basically carry about 137 billion cubic meters of natural gas, while the Nord Stream 1 and 2 combined carry about 120 odd, 110, 120 odd in that regard. So what that would give the Germany is a competitive edge over Europe. With the crisis of the economic crisis that Europe went through, the Germans were trying to achieve dominance through, you know, using oil, sort of oil and gas, and in particular gas out of, and so if they could actually create disturbances and were encouraging the Ukrainians to up their expectations of what they wanted from the Russians, and putting pressure on the Russians that will cut off your supply into Europe, and we want to be paid more. By creating that, what it did was it created a lot of pressure on Russia to supply through Nord Stream 1 and 2 Germany. That could give Germany over time a competitive advantage over the other states, in particular some of the northern states and others who are reliant on that gas. They would have to buy it through Germany. Germany would be the middleman. As a consequence, would extend their control and influence. So on the one hand, they'd be dumping on a whole lot of the South and many other countries windmills and solar farms. They'd be getting cheap natural gas to fuel their production. So their companies would basically be churning out all this green tech, while everybody else was buying it, expensive energy, becoming less competitive. And Germany was very competitive and also dominated the energy market at both ends, both on the green part and the non-green part, the carbon part. So it was a very interesting strategy. The Americans had noticed that and realized, they let it go for a while, and then they realized that this could potentially cause themselves problems, because at the end of the day, America doesn't support one nation. It doesn't support any nation. It really tries to balance the frictions of its allies in order to maintain its influence and get the benefit of maintaining that influence. So it sees its role as more of a global power, and so it doesn't get too much involved in those sort of things. But once it started seeing that the way these things were being played out, this is why even the Americans supported Greece on a number of occasions against the Germans. It wasn't accidental. That was a deliberate strategy on the American side, for their own reasons, because unstabilizing these other countries, there is the potential risk that, you know, there could be a fracture of the alliance, and they didn't want that either. So there's a lot of things that were trying to be managed, so to speak. And then on the other hand, you had a whole lot of revisionist powers like Turkey, Russia, you know, China, and a few others around the world that were trying to, you know, eke out their own little empires, their own little sort of spheres of influence and all that. Turkey was heavily involved with a lot of the Brotherhood and a number of these extremist elements in the Middle East, and the Arabs saw this as, you know, Turkey trying to come in and dominate the Arab world again through these proxies. And so they got really narky about this. And that also created friction between them and the Americans. Ultimately, we see that now playing out where the Americans, Biden turns up and asks, and they just go bugger off, you know, because they don't view the Americans as reliable allies anymore for backing Turkey in the past, even though now the relationship between Turkey and the US has diminished. Back then, it was very strong and very close, especially under the Obama regime, who was using Turkey as a Trojan horse against the Russians in Central Asia and against the Arabs in the Middle East for its own nefarious. Obviously, the Turks were more than willing to accept that role because they could get benefits out of it. They could accrue territory, money, and all sorts of other things, and markets. So they weren't going to knock that back. And the Americans were just using them as a useful tool for their own benefit. Well, their relationship fell apart because they started becoming too buddy-buddy with the Russians. And so that's where things went haywire. It's because Turkey started thinking, especially under Erdogan, a lot of arrogance that man has, started thinking, you know, he could follow independent policy because he'd, you know, followed it up until then. Obama gave him a lot of leeway, but he took it way beyond what they expected him to do. So he became more of a nuisance and a problem for them in the long run, which he has. So that's the sort of thing that sort of has happened, and he's lashed out, you know, towards countries in the region. Obviously, you know, Turkey, as you know, still has revisionist views towards Greece. That's not going to change. They've had them since the late 50s. They've just been getting worse and worse over time. It doesn't matter who's in power. It won't make any difference. They'll still maintain their revisionist doctrine. They ignore their own treaties, which says they only possess any island and rock within 3 miles off their coast. The rest is Greece's, and it's quite clear. And the named islands in the agreement, the treaty, are quite clear. Has to do with their status, whether there's soldiers on them and how many and stuff like that, or fortifications and naval bases. Nothing to do with anything else. So, yeah, it's there's a lot of revisionism that's actually happened in the last couple of decades, and it really is a testimony to the doctrine, the Obama doctrine, that was deliberately designed. Let's just stir the pot a bit. Let's just stir things up and let's see where they fall, and then we'll come in as the saviors. Sort of thinking behind it. There are some people within the deep state in the US and within the political establishment that are very uncomfortable about how things have actually played out. They look at Russia, they look at China. They're creating big spheres of influence that they can't stop with the BRIC nations and many other things, and that's really concerning the US deep state quite a bit. So the Obama doctrine, again, another arrogant doctrine, like some of the past doctrines that the US have had, the domino thing and Nixon's doctrine and a whole lot of others, and they've pretty much failed. Some regards, they achieved a few things that they were aiming. In other regards, they were trying to control forces that they just can't control. No country in the world you may be able to influence certain parts. You may be able to make certain countries dependent on you, reliant on you, or whatever. But ultimately, you can't control things. Yeah, you can do the odd dictatorship here or there for smaller countries or whatever, but larger countries, much harder. You have to have domestic people that want to work with you to be able to achieve something like that, and it has to be in their interests. Most more complex, bigger nations are much harder to control, and that's the reality. And America doesn't have the capacity that it had years ago, and most of those nations realize that, and that's why they're taking the position that they're taking. Smaller nations still fall in line under the US for the simple reason that they feel that they need them for their security. That's about it. That's the only reason. It's pretty much the reason why Eastern Europe is, like Poland and many of the other Eastern European countries are like welded nearly to the US alliance for that exact reason. But it's, very interesting what's been happening as well. But there's a lot of hypocrisy, and it's not only the Germans when it comes to their energy policy or the general EU policy that the Germans drove, but also the British themselves. I mean, the previous government, previous Prime Minister of Britain, she tried to, even though on the economic front she was doing some things that were really strange, she shouldn't have been doing, certain fiscal and monetary policies that were a bit problematic. But on the other hand, one thing that she did do that was positive, that, for oil and gas, to increase oil and gas exploration and extraction, which the current leader has actually got rid of, which, pretty much is condemning Britain to having to import a lot of oil and gas from other parts of the world. Now, as you know, there hasn't been one pipeline in the Ukraine destroyed, not one. I wonder why. And there's still gas pouring out through that. And so obviously the Americans wanted to sever the Nord Stream 1 and Nord Stream 2 because that was in their interest, to force the Germans under the American umbrella again. And yes, in line again, which is really what it was behind. But that's created a lot of problems. And now we've got these lunatics in Brussels who are aggressively green on the one hand and aggressively anti-Russian and sanction crazy on the other hand. It's just created a disaster for Europe, generally speaking. But there's a lot of hypocrisy because they're still actually acquiring a lot of energy and stuff like that. Now, if you take a look, up until very recently, most oil and gas would take only either less than a day. If it's coming from Algeria, Middle East, maybe 1 or 2 days, a couple of days. It wouldn't take very long. From Russia, about 4 days. So the transit time, the shipping time, was way more reduced. So that kept the cost down, and also now it's coming from further afield. It could take up to 30 days, like from India, for instance. Interesting. Current Prime Minister of UK, Indian. Yes, helping out his, maybe, I don't know, is he invested in some of those, or his family? I wonder. Maybe people should look into those sort of things in that regard. So now it's taken about 30 odd days to get to the UK. Now the UK wasn't getting anything from India. In just the last, the year or whatever, there's been over 220 ships, tankers, that have been going to Britain from India. I'll actually show you the refinery. It's one of the biggest refineries. It actually produces like 6 times the refining compared to Greece. And Greece is a bigger refiner, one of the biggest refiners in Europe. It produces 6 times what it requires. So 5 times more. So this is 6, it's just massive. And I'll just show you a Google image of it. So this is the refinery, Jamnagar refinery. The Reliance refinery complex also is within this area. It's on the west coast. So that's refining. This is storage close to the terminals. That's the Reliance one. I'll just come out and you can actually see where we are. Coming out further. So through here, through the Gulf of Aden, through the Red Sea, into the Aegean, sorry, into the Eastern Mediterranean. Go up here. Remember, there's Alexandroupoli in Greece, a big terminal. They can actually go push stuff through there, or they can go all the way through here and up to the UK, or Rotterdam in the Netherlands, which is a big port. From this location here is one of the biggest refineries on the planet. Guess where it gets its oil from, kiddies? From Mother Russia, of course. Where else? Oh, that's right. We've got sanctions against them, do we? Or are we just virtual signaling? Are there real sanctions, or are we just virtual signaling to the population? Because it looks like it, and it's very expensive virtual signaling. You know, the Great Reset is, we're not going to do this dirty business. We'll leave it for those the Asians and Africans and others to do all that dirty business. We'll do clean stuff. We're green. Exactly. You know, crazy ass. But it's there are big business interests in this, global business interests. They don't care. They've seen the decline of, they've actually initiated the decline of Western Europe and North America, in particular Western Europe, and large parts of it. And they're going, well, you know, populations are declining here. Things are shrinking. Things are not going really much, but it's their policies that have brought this about. And so the elites, you know, they want to thin out the herd. So it's an area, and then ship most of this dirty stuff to happen elsewhere. Nothing new. It's happened before in the past, you know, so in the old colonial days. So that's the sort of attitude. The thing is, who are the people invested in all this sort of stuff? That's what you have to look at. Forget about, you know, which country it is in. You got to track the money. And when you track the money, you start seeing these whole so-called globalists. They're not so green. And there are a bunch of hypocrites who ship out this so-called dirty business. It's not dirty. It's cheaper to do it there. They can make bigger profits, and they ship it all the way back for 30 days, and they make shitloads of profit. It's a great deal. I mean, most people don't realize that 40%, I'm not kidding you, 40% of Ukraine oil, of diesel and oil and stuff like that, that's used for their military machine, the diesel primarily, 40% of their diesel comes from Russian refined oil. I'm not kidding you. You can't even make this shit up. It's so crazy. 40%, that's nearly half their oil comes from the Russians. The Russians know, you know, business is business. You know, war is war, business is business. It's just crazy system. But pretty much most of those tanks, most of those armored vehicles, most of those transport vehicles, most of those aircraft that are flying over with jet fuel and diesel fuel for those vehicles, it's all, nearly half of it is Russian. That's the craziness of the world. But it doesn't surprise me. I mean, even in the Second World War, there was actually a lubricant, and there was also a special chemical that the Germans would get out of Switzerland. And the Swiss used to buy from the US because only the US was the biggest producer. And it was critical for engines like aircraft engines. Business is business. And even in war times, the Bank of International Settlements, the Bank of Bankers, was still doing business with both sides, with the British, Treasury, and with the German via Switzerland, obviously. So yeah, that's how the world really works, guys. The rest of us are just basically cannon fodder and told to hate one another or whatever, so these people can divide and rule and exploit. And by creating all these crises and devaluing things and all that, what they can do is out of the crisis, there's opportunity to make money. All crises, there is either war opportunity, there's either money to be made by, being able to buy assets on the cheap when you've actually weakened our economy. Come in and just buy everything. And then there's actually less that population has each time the crisis ends. Just look at the US. Once we actually liberated the bankers to be able to do as they like, what happened in America? Slowly but surely, the middle class were eroded. That was Reaganomics. That was basically Reaganomics, okay? These people, Reaganomics never worked. Thatcherism never worked, because as long as you've got bankers and you've got central banks, and these people can manipulate a lot of these financial instruments, they're going to make the money in a more deregulated way. So yeah, it's nonsense. Unless you've got hard currency, and unless you've got rules that prevent monopolization and many other things, these people will, gouge the system and take most of the benefits. Just the way it is, has been since the pharaohs. So people will tell you all this sort of nonsense. Yes, I mean, I'm a person that believes in market setting the prices. I would never I'll permit or accept a politician to set the prices like they do in Europe at the moment. It's outrageous. But at the same time, I wouldn't allow some of these corporations to do as they like. There's a difference. There's a difference between market freedom, and there's a difference to rape and pillage, so to speak, is what these people are doing, and to deliberately hoard and to deliberately undermine extraction. Look at what's happening in Europe. Europe could be energy independent. Why is Greece not getting the gas out? Why is it saying, mate, we're in the middle of the biggest crisis in Europe, and Germany's saying nothing? Absolutely nothing. And they've got all this expensive energy coming from all these different parts of the world. It's bullshit. If you look at it, it's just bullshit. And they don't really care about the people on this planet, even. I mean, there's competition in space. The long term is competition because there's resources out there, a lot of them. They just want an easier economic way of getting out there. And that's why there's competition. They're carving up space, and they're carving up, even Elon Musk is involved with NASA to be able to carve up parts of Mars and other things like that. Same thing with when it comes to the moon. Helium-3, great for nuclear power. So if you've got a fusion reactor and you put helium-3 in it, you don't need the sort of, it's got no neutron radiation, guys. It doesn't need a lot of very sophisticated containment systems, let alone electrostatically. You can get about nearly, theoretically, 70% efficiency. You can't do that with any source of energy. So we're talking about massive energy density through these sort of fusion powers. The long-term competition will be over who controls helium-3 on the moon. So that's why the Space Command was developed by Trump. He had no option. He was told by the deep state, that's what you're going to create. He put a file in front of him. They made it sound really good for him. He's just a real estate mogul. He's got no idea about the deep state and their politics. State Department and all these characters, they just write everything and let him go to some extent. It's a problem with, his heart may have been right in a few on a few fronts, on a whole lot of other fronts. I don't think he really understood deeply how things would operate. He was, one of those, I can make a deal. I can, I don't need to go around clobbering everyone, which is good, The deep state doesn't like that because they like clobbering people and putting them back in their place and controlling them. His approach was different, very unorthodox. But don't worry, they had a lot of people around him that could get, what they wanted through. Now, some of his, there are a few so-called cheerleaders within his own party who are very much a part of the globalist group. And they go to his, you know who they are, Lindsay and many others. These people that basically are hypocrites and are trying to, manage people like him, like Trump. So I don't see Trump as a savior. I don't care what people think. If they disagree with me, that's your problem. He's just a businessman. He's got a few okay ideas, a few not so okay. And on a lot of issues, he's got no idea what's happening. So, which is a bit the problem with, there is a small deep state group, and they control the narrative and push certain things, and most of these people just follow the program. So don't expect major things. But it's interesting, a few other things that are happening in some parts of Eastern Europe. Hungarians seem to be, holding off from, adding. They've decided just recently to allow Finland and Sweden to join NATO. Seems so. Turkey's holding out as last with their blackmails, and that's not going to get them very far in the long run because Americans hate being blackmailed, especially since they consider themselves to be the empire. You can't blackmail the empire without consequences. That's what's happening in most parts of the world. Things are not too far away, probably 10 days maybe, before all hell will break loose on the Eastern Front, so to speak, Eastern Ukraine. So things are sort of amassing. There's very little at the moment, very little movement of logistics and stuff like that. There's still a few things coming in, but not much. It's pretty much all. They're just waiting for it to get a bit colder. It's been seasonally a bit warmer this winter, which has meant that they haven't actually got, enough. The firmness of the ground isn't exactly where they want it to be. They're probably hoping that within the next 10 days it'll get there. So before that happens, this whole lunacy about getting tanks to the Ukrainians and all that at this stage, and 30 tanks here, 14 tanks here, or whatever, it takes months to train people. It's just ridiculous. The easiest way would be to just hand them a whole lot of tanks that countries like Romania has, Bulgaria has, a lot of these states have, tanks that they are familiar with, that they know how to use, the Ukrainians, and then pretty much replace those tanks with American, German, and whatever, and other tanks from other parts of Europe. And that guarantees two things. One, you upgrade the tank forces of the Eastern European countries and give them a bit more capability than what they've had up to now without them having to cough a lot of money. So it's a cheaper upgrade. It improves the security of NATO. Plus, at the same time, it also minimizes the potential risk of Western technology being captured by the Russians. So there's all these implications that are not being taken into consideration, because we've got a Biden who's been pressuring the Germans to hand over their best kit, and he's not prepared to hand over his. And now they're actually looking at Egypt, like they've even approached the Egyptians. This is how crazy it gets. A lot of the tanks that the Americans have got either Cobham armor, which is a British sort of armor, or a spin-off for their earlier models. It's these ceramic sort of layers. And then also they've got depleted uranium. They're not going to, definitely wouldn't hand that sort of armor over. And so it's really hard for them to take that stuff off and then put something new on. And that's why I say they've even approached the Egyptians, asking them whether they are willing to provide them with armored vehicles, because they've got Abrams as well, but with an export composite, which is compatible to probably the T90, probably not as good as the T90's armor, but competitive in that regard. But at the same time, it's just all this craziness at the, I think the game's up anyway, but, it's sort of, they want to be able to say, oh, we tried, but we failed in the end. That's how they'll sell it once that failure happens. But the reality is it's cost a lot of people a lot of lives, and it's cost a lot of treasure for a lot of people. And it's impoverished both Americans and Europeans severely, because they are the populations with the most expensive energy at the moment in the world. Asia is getting cheap energy from Russia, and many other parts of the world are also getting cheap energy from Russia or countries that are closely aligned. The reality is that it's could potentially, as we move through this year, get even bleaker, especially if this sort of summer, you're supposed to get a certain level of frost, and then the trees will start producing more in the spring. If they don't go through that cycle, they don't set up properly, certain trees. So there's a lot of that sort of stuff where certain types of foods could be a bit more scarce later on this year. So there's a lot of those sort of things, implications. There's a lot of shells and stuff like that have fallen in large parts of the Ukraine, and it's making it very difficult to plow and very difficult to also without risks to farmers. And so that could actually affect later on this year's production as well. So there's a lot of issues happening on a lot of fronts in that regard. So I think that at the moment we're in the lull before the next crisis. Things are just going to get a bit worse before they get better, unfortunately. Just really, you need to prepare for things to get a bit worse, I think, in the next 2 years. And, long term, I think where the West pretty much is in decline, and globally we're moving to a sort of a new feudal capitalism, pretty much. So it's happening in both sides, at both ends to some extent, but more within Europe and North America and parts like that, especially in Europe. We're moving to this new feudalism, very few controlling most assets, and a rapidly declining middle class. That's really the future, unfortunately, from here on until 2030 plus. Beyond that, hard to say how rebellious the population is going to, whether new political forces emerge in Europe and elsewhere and force a different direction. So it's really hard to predict. But for the next, at least projecting outwards for the next 70 years, things are looking as they will deteriorate even further. So initially we'll get a bit of a high deterioration in the next 2 years, and then after that it will be much slower. But because you've already dropped to a certain level, it's much harder then to drop dramatically, unless end of civilization events happen. But I don't think that's going to happen. But we're going to see a massive decline in living standards in Europe in the next 7 years. In North America, it's going to be less pronounced, but it will happen there as well, because the agendas that are being pursued for expensive energy are way too problematic. The same thing in Australasia. We've got the crazies trying to push expensive energy. Australia's just awash with energy, and we've exported large parts of our refining to Singapore and elsewhere, and pretty much no longer control domestic production, no longer have any interest in petrochemicals in this country. So it seems like the West has just decided to go green bonkers, and our future is going to be quite inflationary and problematic. Probably Australia's not as bad out of all the Western countries, and the reason for that is a smaller population, still exporting a lot of minerals, primary resources. We are moving into a commodity-based world. It's not surprising even people like Bill Gates understands that and has bought up a whole lot of farmland and stuff like that. A lot of these people are buying up mines around the world and stuff like that, gold mines and all sorts of things, because they realize the future is a commodities-based future. Most of the current ethereal type assets are losing their shine when you've got expensive energy and a competition on energy, which drives up cost. At the end of the day, those societies that can get access to that cheap energy, they'll do better. Those societies that can't, both deliberately or for mismanagement reasons, they'll suffer more. But that's how things are playing out at the moment. It's a bit of a mixed bag, let's put it that way. But even in certain parts of the world that are growing rapidly, like India, Southeast Asia, and other parts, there are a lot of problems there as well. There's a lot of food insecurity in the poorer parts of the population because of the cost of energy and food is still affecting those people as well. And we can see even in India, even before the crisis, that the cost of producing stuff was going up, and a lot of farmers couldn't compete or couldn't stay in the industry, and were being squeezed out, and many of them were just committing suicide. Indian farm suicide rates are very high, some of the highest in the world. And obviously what's happening is, as these small farmers are being squeezed out, big multinationals and even big agri-businesses within India themselves are just buying up everything. As I said, this sort of globalized type of cabal that's actually emerged on the planet even though it may be competing against each other, may be divided between this sort of BRICS and non-BRICS, or, it's not exactly like that, but you know what I mean. But even that, they have common interests. They're all for the global reset because they want this to become the new feudal lords of the planet. And that's what happens when people get far too much wealth, and with that follows a lot of arrogance. And if the political system is being corrupted and controlled directly by these people, then you don't even have politicians being able to bring them into check. Like we had in the past, antitrust laws, breaking up these big entities, stuff like that. Really, we have to go back to that sort of legislation to break these organizations up, to deal with them effectively. They're out of control, and there are some politicians, on all sorts of, both on the left and the right, that realize this, and they're trying to combat some of this these perverse incentives and the way the system's working at the moment. But they're lone voices here or there. They don't have a lot of traction at the moment, but they're pointing out some truths about the system. I mean, I recently just put up a post of an American politician from Arizona, and he was pointing out about, most of the problems that's bankrupting the US is Medicare. That's what it is. It's the big one. Even the pension system is only minor, that can be managed. The big one is really the Medicare system. And the reason why that's blown out of proportion, for simple: too many people with too many comorbidities. Big pharma and the big agribusinesses, the big food industries that pretty much invest in each other. They are rigging the system. They are extracting a lot of wealth out of the system by keeping people sick with poor diets and medications. They control the narrative. They control the political establishment. They control the institutions that set the guidelines for food and for medicines. And that's a large part of the problem. And then you incentivize doctors with corrupt practices of, drug reps turning up and giving them little gifts and stuff like that if they sell more drugs to their patients. The whole system is really very problematic. America's probably got another decade before things really start unraveling for them, where their interest servicing will double, and that's going to be very hard for them to be able to deal with that. But if they were able to curtail a lot of their health spending, some of their military spending as well, it probably would help them in a big way in bringing down. Otherwise, too many benefits and too many global power games. Remember what destroyed the Roman Empire? They overextended themselves. And until the end, they didn't realize how much they'd overextended themselves until it was nearly too late. Eventually became too late. So whether the US wakes up in time, hard to say. It'll matter really, like in every country, it will really matter on the population, how well informed the population is and how much they realize that they have to act. We're not talking about violence here, turning the society upside down like a Soviet revolution or whatever. That's not, or a French Revolution. That's just going to end up with a lot of blood and destruction and some dictator. That's not going to help anyone. Really, what we really need is peaceful pressure and massive amounts. That's really what, and once such a popular movement grows and demands grow to change direction, that's when there are possibilities there. Otherwise, things could really unravel into extremes of left or right, and a lot of dead people after the fact. So we've seen it play out in the 20th century. Hopefully it won't play out in the 21st century in the same destructive way, but that's up to us, all of us, to point out. People like me or a few other people can't be the only people that send information to politicians and say, well, what about this? Why aren't you doing this? And pointing things out, because things aren't going to change on their own. They never have. Even Gandhi in the early days with his doing some of his initial protests didn't really work. It's only when he realized that he needed to get the whole population behind him, that's what stopped. Take a look at even Turkey, the recent coup attempt in the 2016. Even though Erdogan exploited that and turned it into an advantage for him, but at the end of the day, people got out and said no, so it didn't happen. So you can stop things. Unfortunately, people didn't stop all these people. They allowed others to get away with it. Maybe because sometimes you do something and then fatigue sets in. And it's hard to basically be persistent when you've got family you have to support and all that. It's not an easy thing. But the reality is that we just can't allow things just to happen. Because if we do, we could end up in the Third World War. Because some of these crazies are really just pushing, too many buttons. And First World War and Second World War, did happen by a lot of accidents. There was a lot of appeasement of Hitler, which eventually blew in their face. And there was a lot of, before the First World War, there was a lot of animosity and sniping back and forward. And it just took one incident for all hell to break loose on the planet. And, that could happen again. If these crazies are saying, let's push more and, let's push more forces and let's get certain elements. Already the Poles are in the boots and all in the Ukraine, fighting with the Ukrainians. They shouldn't be, because they're a NATO nation and there's potential risks there. But there's a lot of this sort of nonsense that's happening, and it's really causing a lot of these problems. It doesn't excuse what the Russians did. No, I'm being quite clear about that. But at the same time, the Minsk agreements were bullshit agreements to buy time so they could organize the Ukrainians. So it had nothing to do, and it was more to use the Ukrainians as cannon fodder to weaken Russia. So, again, people being used for the wrong reasons. But that's how that played out. But the thing is, a take-home message about the future, it's not looking good, unfortunately. So you need to, you and your families, and to consider having some hard assets, having some land, things like that, something to fall back on to avoid potential homelessness or losing everything. So there are high risks, and in some parts of the world even higher, depends where you are on the planet. But all I can say is you should prepare, you should have, consider canned food, and in our case, things like sardines and things like that, or cured meats, maybe even things like a generator, just in case the power goes out, or UPS, an uninterrupted power supply unit with a battery storage. So if the power does go off, your refrigeration doesn't spoil a lot of your meats and stuff like that. Sourcing large animals directly from a farmer, so it actually costs you less. Cut it all up, put it in a deep fridge, buy a cheap deep fridge off, something like Gumtree in Australia, eBay or whatever, whatever's in your country, could actually provide you with some level of food security. So all these sort of things, you really have to, we really need to start putting some proactive steps to protect ourselves, because don't expect the governments to do much. They'll throw a bit of money here and there at election time, but they're not going to be doing a lot. The reality is you can see the hypocrisy. On the one hand, there is so much shale oil and gas throughout the whole of Europe. There's a whole lot of natural gas, in particular in the Eastern Mediterranean and areas like that. And what do we have? We have policies, green policies in Europe that are not actually extracting it. Now, there's a bit of 20% that comes out of Newport, which is US exports to Europe. That is getting closer to being resolved after that explosion in Newport. And so there may be that gas may be restored. So that'll have some sort of short-term benefit to Europe. But long-term, fundamentally, we need to start extracting hydrocarbon fuels again in Europe. Simple as that. If Europe doesn't do that, you're stuffed. You really are stuffed in that regard. So unfortunately, there was Europe was set up as a cartel, and initially the French and German and Italian cartel, industrial cartel, and then sort of they tried to make some sort of quasi European free market out of it, and then after that they tried to make it some sort of super state or something like that. They never asked the people, and they never worked with the people, and it was never in the interest of the actual European people, and that's why it had a lot of limitations. The initial, maybe the early, there may have been some utopian romantists that were hoping for something better to stop the bloodletting in Europe by sort of uniting Europe, but it didn't happen. And I think a lot of people are responsible for that not happening. I think the biggest problem was, as well, in this sort of common market, is the common currency has been a disaster for a lot of the smaller countries, an absolute disaster. It's left them in a very difficult financial mess. At the time when they did actually adopt the common currency, what they should have done is they should have had an insurance policy, and there should have been certain, either you could have done two ways. Either you had an insurance policy for any defaults or whatever else on the one hand, and on the other hand, you could have set up an authority that regulated interest rates within your entity. So let's say you're in Greece, and the productivity of the society, a lot of other factors, were taken into consideration of the GDP. It would basically set an interest rate much higher than, for instance, Germany or Belgium or, some other country. And what that would do is that would curtail over exuberance. So, and that difference, you could either do it two ways. You could use that as an income to drive down debt for the government, or you could have the lower rate, but you could put a surcharge on it. And that surcharge could go into a fund that could provide money as as security if things went bad. So there's a lot of things that could have been done differently in the common currency that weren't done. And it wasn't as if these people didn't realize that there was a potential of not having fiscal union, that a monetary crisis could emerge. They even thought about it in the early days of the creation of the common currency, but they thought that that would drive people together. No, crises never drive people together. They drive people apart. How the hell you could think of something like that is beyond me. But that was the thinking back then. In hindsight, people think of it and go, that's bloody crazy. But that was the thinking that was happening. Anyway, guys, that's about it. To give you a bit of a background, what's been happening and stuff like that, and some interesting intrigues that are playing out. You need to get on your blowers, especially in Europe, and tell your police to start getting oil and gas out of the ground ASAP, because that's the only thing that's going to save Europe and many other parts of the world, is cheap energy. That's what created the modern world. It wasn't windmills and solar farms. It was cheap energy. And currently, the big corporates are exploiting that. See, traditionally, governments would have forced them not to hold on to licensed areas, but to exploit it, to extract. If you're not extracting out of that area, we take the license off you. That's how it used to work. Now these people are just grabbing license, just sitting on them, because the governments are telling them, don't exploit them, or won't even give them, in some cases, licenses, because they don't want them exploited because of their this green lunatic agenda. This is the problem, and we, the citizens, need to start being proactive, because if we want the living standards like people had in the 50s and 60s and all that, that came from cheap energy. The middle classes emerged out of cheap energy after the Second World War. Without cheap energy, you cannot have a viable middle class anywhere on the planet. Cheap energy created the middle class, and if we get rid of cheap energy, we'll destroy the middle class and create, again, a feudal capitalism, where there's a small group that has everything and the vast majority just labour or have very little, like existed in the 18th century, 17th century, and all the other previous centuries. Do we want to go back to that? Do you want your kids going back to that, your grandkids or whatever? It's up to us, all of us, to basically say, no, no more this bullshit. We've had enough. Either you change or we'll get rid of you. And we don't want the extremists either. That's not a solution. They just destroy things. They don't create things. What we want is, if they don't exist in our country, we could always set things up. We could talk to like-minded people and set up a centrist movement for radical change for our society. And we could call it, a centrist patriotic movement for this, or something like that. Or we could call it, depending on the society, some sort of name to indicate that, one, you're a centralist, and two, that you're a patriot and want to save your society from, where it's heading towards a brick wall. Anyway, that's about it. Food for thought. See yous.